Thank you so much, Steffi. It's such a pleasure to be here with you today and having the opportunity to share with you some of our latest thinking surrounding technology and the future of work. A few years ago, when I presented here at DLD, we had a new study out estimating that roughly 47% of American jobs are exposed to automation. And the question that we consistently received since then is this time different somehow? And I remember thinking to myself, different compared to what? Because we've been through times of rapid technological change before, and what I'm here to tell you is that there are certain things, at least, that we can learn from the past. The future is uncertain and unpredictable, but some patterns tend to repeat themselves. One such pattern is that there is a lot of anxiety surrounding automation today, with few people being enthusiastic about the tornado that is coming for the office. And in fact, a majority of Americans now believe that there should be legislation on the number of jobs that businesses should be allowed to automate away. Now, if you take a long view of technological progress, that is puzzling, because I was told that the very reason that economic growth was stagnant for such a long time was the absence of mechanization. Economic growth only took off with the first machine age around 1800, which allowed us to produce more with fewer people. And as a result of that, incomes in the industrial West are roughly 40 times higher than they were at the onset of the first industrial revolution. Now, that, if anything, understates the transformation that has taken place, because it doesn't make much sense to compare incomes in 1750 with incomes today, right? The consumer basket that you can buy is so different. Back in 1750, ordinary people could only look at the lives of the wealthy and envy, who had servants to do the most tedious things for them. Today, we all have access to the electric servant in terms of dishwashers, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, that relieve us of so much tedious work. And if that wasn't enough evidence of progress, consider the fact that earning those higher incomes and producing that abundance of new goods and services has become so much more comfortable as well. Not so long ago, a lot of people worked in coal mines. They didn't see daylight for weeks. Cave-ins and explosions were part of everyday working life, and lung disease often part of the work package. Today, most of us in this room, at least, work in air-conditioned offices. The worst thing that's happened at Oxford Martin School in recent memory was when the coffee machine broke down. And this puts things in perspective. Unfortunately, I'm here to tell you that this long-run story of growth and prosperity is only half of the story. What did people actually say during the Industrial Revolution when growth took off? Well, people were actually of very different views. Benjamin Disraeli, before he became Prime Minister of Britain, wrote a book called Coningsby, in which one character remarks, "I see cities peopled with machines. Certainly Manchester must be the most wonderful place of modern times." The very same year as Coningsby was published, Frederick Engels published his Conditions on the Working Classes, which was written during a stay in precisely Manchester. Now, Engels had a very different view on the matter. He argued that machinery only serves to downgrade people, deprive them of their jobs and incomes, and reduce people's wages. We know that both Engels and Marx were wrong about the long run, but they were actually fairly right about the period they observed, because even as the British economy took off, wages remained flat for 7 decades. And that is not even considering those at the lower end of the income distribution whose wages were actually reduced. The cohorts born in 1750 were actually taller than the cohorts born in 1850. People's nutrition was adversely impacted by this as well. Now, a puzzle to economists and economic historians is, why would people actually have voluntarily agreed to participate in the industrialization process if it reduced their utility? The simple answer is that they didn't. They rioted against the mechanized factory on several occasions. They petitioned to Parliament to block the introduction of new technologies. And I think that it's important to remember that what began with the construction of the first factories ended with the construction of the railroads, also ended with the publication of the Communist Manifesto. A lot of revolutionary technologies brought a lot of political revolutionaries along the way. Now, I'm not here to predict a socialist revolution, but I do find it noteworthy that income disparities have been rising in recent years and are again approaching levels not seen since the first industrial revolution. And the driver of this is not steam power or spinning machines, it is computerization. And sure, computers were invented long before the 1980s. The first electronic computer to be invented was at the University of Pennsylvania in 1946. But it took the microprocessor and the personal computer for them to have any meaningful impact on economic activity and the labor market. And it was only when businesses could restructure supply chains so that they could take advantage of cheap labor in countries like China, and that they could begin automate away a lot of routine manual jobs, that we saw an impact on productivity growth and labor markets. And this has been very good for some of us. I'm an economist. I can export my ideas across the world because of computer technologies. I'm also more productive as an analyst because I can use statistical software. But has it been great for everyone? The answer is simply no. If you look at the wages of prime-age men with no more than a high school degree in the United States, their wages have not just been stagnant, they've been falling consecutively for 3 decades now. And this is the group who would have flocked into the factories before the dawn of automation. Now, one of my favorite lines from the book is that if you put one hand in the freezer and another on the stove, you should be feeling quite comfortable on average. And we know from experience that that is not the case. The same can be said about the employment statistics. And if you look at the aggregates, the numbers look pretty good. But if you dig down to the communities that have been adversely impacted by deindustrialization, a combination of globalization and automation, you find a very different story. Where jobs have dried up, we also see a lot of social ills, such as faltering marriage, rising crimes, worsening health outcomes. Certain communities are in despair. And we shouldn't be so surprised if these communities also opt for radical political change, regardless of that those alternatives may be desirable or not. If we want to understand why President Trump won the election in 2016, industrialization is a key part of the story. We've already seen a backlash against globalization, and we should not assume that technology is immune to backlash either. Now, the worrying part of this is that we have seen nothing yet. As artificial intelligence becomes more pervasive, so will automation and its effects. It used to be the case that machines held a comparative advantage in routine rule-based activities that can easily be specified in computer code. Today, machines can learn themselves. They can tap into our experience in terms of the data trails we leave behind us, and they can learn through trial and error. And basically everything from autonomous vehicles to Google Translate is driven by these developments. Now, some of you will say, these autonomous cars, where are they? And Google Translate I used yesterday, it's not that great, is it? But I think it's important to remember that the first steam engines were merely used to drain coal mines, and even that they would do particularly well. Every revolution in new technology has begun with imperfect technology. According to our estimates, roughly 47% of American jobs are at risk of automation. There are roughly 3.5 million cashiers in the United States today. If you go to an Amazon Go store, you won't see a single one. There are roughly another 3.5 million employed as bus drivers, truck drivers, taxi drivers, and so on. And there are still 2.2 million people working in call centers, just to name a few. Now, underlying this figure are 702 different occupations and their relative exposure to automation. And you can imagine that when we published this, a lot of people went through all of this and made a few jokes about some of the occupations and whether they are actually automatable. And fashion models was one of them. So my friend Ken Cookier used to tease us for suggesting that fashion models were exposed to automation. These models and these pictures here actually don't exist. They've been generated by what's called generative adversarial networks, which have created them from thousands of pictures, and they're already being used by companies like Dior. Now, I think that if we look at this just in terms of job replacement, however, that is likely to very much understate the transformation that is coming. So think about the arrival of the electric motor, right? In the early days, it was simply used to replace the steam engine as the prime mover in the factory, right? But eventually, people figured out that you can equip every single machine with its own electric motor, and therefore you can just sequence the machines to the natural flow of production. This idea eventually gave rise to the age of mass production. It created the people's vehicles in terms of the T-Ford, and it was eventually applied to every industry. It transformed the way every corporation worked. If you think about something like driverless cars, or if you compare that, for example, to the first automobile, right? Automobile didn't just take the horse carriage and replace the horse with an internal combustion engine. It changed the way our cities are structured. It enabled suburban life. It gave rise to petrol station, road commerce, tourism, so on and so forth. And I think that we can imagine that autonomous vehicles are going to transform our cities and the way that we actually commute more broadly. You can think, for example, of the endless possibilities associated with having a very heavy car that it's equipped by airbags, which is an internal combustion engine with thousands of moving parts, and reducing that to something much, much lighter. You can even sort of change the way this car looks. And it may well be that, unlike this 50s version where people playing board games, we will all get a Netflix subscription. Or the car will have a mini bar, and that will be the most expensive part on your trip. But in every case, I think that this is going to transform our cities more broadly, and it's going to have a chain of effects across a variety of industries. Now, one thing that I do find very unpredictable, though, is the democratic response to this. I think that the economist Leontief was onto something when he suggested that if horses could have joined the Democratic Party and voted, what happened on the farms might have turned out differently. They might have used a political voice to bring the spread of the tractor to a halt. Now, we're already seeing some of these examples. This is a picture of dock workers in Los Angeles who went on strike the other week for the fear of losing their jobs to machinery. This is another picture of truck drivers in the state of Missouri who are demanding legislation to ban autonomous vehicles in that state, and some politicians are now considering supplying such legislation. Now, the key point is not that we're not going to have enough jobs going forward. If you go back to 1900 and ask a farm labor, what do you think that your grandchildren are going to do? He wouldn't have said, well, I think my daughter is probably going to be a software engineer, and my son is going to be a hot yoga instructor, and my grandson is probably going to be a travel agent. Nobody could imagine those jobs back then. In a similar fashion, we struggle to imagine jobs of the future. We can at least now cast some of the occupations that are just emerging. And if you look at those, just emerging on LinkedIn in the past 5 years, you find jobs like iOS developers, big data architects, you also find sumo instructors, and you also find Beachbody coaches. And the reason for that, I think, is simply that as new, very skilled jobs emerge, we tend to demand a lot of in-person type of services that are very hard to automate. And this is what is driving the economic divergence that we've seen over the past couple of decades. We've seen cities that's used to specialized in manufacturing jobs, seeing jobs disappearing, not just in manufacturing, but the local service economy is also taking a hit because manufacturing jobs also support the incomes of other people in that given city. And in the same way, in cities which specialize in technology, creative industries, finance, those type of services create on average 5 new jobs in local service sectors that people go to the hairdresser, go grocery shopping, take a taxi, and so on and so forth. And this is driving the divergence we're seeing by these skilled cities and these old manufacturing cities. Now, a key theme of the book is that resistance to technological change has been the norm rather than the exception. And I think that a lot of us take progress really for given. But if progress was inevitable, we would have arrived at the Industrial Revolution a little earlier in the history of mankind than after several thousand years. If progress was inevitable, every country would have adopted all the technologies available and every country would be rich. So I think that it is wrong to assume that everything will continue. Now, the theme today is optimism and courage, and I would like to end on an optimistic note, because I think that artificial intelligence has the potential to create a lot more interesting jobs, better paid jobs, and will create goods and services that we can't even imagine. But that optimism rests on having the courage to manage the transition effectively and help those people that struggle to adjust. Because most economists realize that the short-term that technology can have short-term adverse consequences, but the short-term can also be a long time, as the Industrial Revolution illustrates, and we need to manage that transition. Thank you for your attention.